Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of On Attachment. In today's episode, we are talking all about closure after a breakup. So closure is one of those things that we can really easily fixate on. And that makes a lot of sense if a breakup has ended in a way that has left us with a lot of unanswered questions and open loops and feeling like there are so many things we don't understand about what unfolded and why. And when we're in that state of uncertainty, it's really natural that we would seek answers and that we would seek them from the person who we assume is the best place to provide them, being our ex. But as we're going to talk about today, that can get us into a really sticky place where we are holding out for our ex to show up to some conversation in some way that's going to soothe the pain that we're in, that's going to close all the open loops. And I think that oftentimes our expectations or our hopes around getting that closure can keep us holding on for a really long time and in a way that is maybe not conducive to our healing. So in today's episode, I'm going to be talking about why it makes so much sense that you long for closure and that you might fixate on the need to get all of these questions answered. But I'm also going to be sharing some hard truths about closure and why it's probably unlikely that you're going to get closure from your ex and in the form that you're hoping, and how you might reframe closure for yourself so that it's something that you can choose through acceptance rather than waiting around for from someone else. And ultimately, that I think is in service of your processing of a breakup, your grieving, and ultimately your peace and acceptance, which I think is what we all need, even if it's not what we want. We'll also talk about the ways in which you might, whether you realize it or not, be holding on to this need for closure as a way to keep the door open, and that maybe there's a part of you that says you need closure but doesn't actually want that closure because the lack of closure feels like a tether to your ex that you're not quite ready to let go of. So we're going to be talking about all of that today. And I'm hoping that if you're going through a breakup, or maybe you went through a breakup a really long time ago and you still don't have closure and it still haunts you, that what I'm going to share in today's episode will give you a new perspective that might move you towards more peace and healing. Before we get into today's discussion about closure, I did want to remind you that I have a free training all about breakups. So if you're in it at the moment, or as I said, if you have been through a breakup maybe 6 months ago, maybe longer, but you still feel like there's a lot of residue there that you maybe haven't worked through, I'd really encourage you to check out this free training. It's primarily focused on anxious attachment as far as breakups are concerned, and looking at some common pitfalls that anxious attachers can get into in a breakup, and the 3 shifts that will help you to get unstuck and really move through a breakup in a way that not only facilitates your healing, but really allows you to use a breakup as fuel for your evolution and to springboard you into a new chapter of your life, really seeing a breakup as a turning point rather than something that just sends you spiraling downwards. So if that sounds like something that would be supportive for you, I really encourage you to check it out. And the link to register for that is in the show notes. And just to be clear, that is a totally free training. So really nothing to lose by signing up for that one. Okay, so let's talk about closure. Now, as I've spoken about so many times before on the show, we know that breakups are really hard for everyone, and that they're particularly hard for people with anxious attachment patterns because we derive so much safety and security from a relationship, even a dysfunctional one, right? Even one that was really unhealthy. And as a relationship is maybe nearing the end, when it's on its last legs, there's every chance that you were dialing up your efforts to hold it all together, that you were trying so hard to be seen, to be understood, to solve the problems, to put out the fires. And so for it to end in spite of those efforts is very painful and can bring up a lot of really difficult feelings and stories. Not only the grief of losing someone, but feelings of failure and inadequacy, stories of how could they give up so easily? Why would they give up on me? It feels so personal. And of course it does, right? Because breakups involve the loss of an attachment figure, and that is deeply destabilizing to our system. So it makes sense that if you've been through a breakup, and really any breakup, that you'd be feeling a lot of those feelings. Now, what can make it more challenging is when a breakup ends in circumstances that leave you feeling very confused, maybe blindsided, whether you didn't see it coming, it felt very sudden, or there just wasn't adequate conversation around it, such that you feel like you have a lot of question marks, a lot of loose threads, a lot of open loops. For someone with anxious attachment patterns who derive so much safety from certainty and information, having that many unknowns around this deep pain that you're in can really greatly exacerbate your suffering. And if you already felt like you were treading water just by virtue of the breakup itself, having all of those unanswered questions can send you into a bit of a frenzy. And I think what can often happen there is that anxiously attached people will try and solve the pain by going into full-blown rumination mode, so obsessing over what they're doing and almost trying to single-handedly solve the puzzle or find the answers by stalking their Instagram and maybe going back through all of your messages or talking to ChatGPT or watching a million videos online to try and decipher and decode them. And all of that points to the fact that we're maybe trying to avoid the bigness of the grief that we're feeling and that we're maybe pushing against reality. We're in denial of the reality we find ourselves in. And so we're trying to make it all make sense. I think another piece that can drive that kind of behavior is that because our baseline tendency is to internalize and take things very personally. So the story of how could they give up on me so easily? They must not have loved me. They must not have cared. That's a very common interpretation for anxiously attached people. It's almost like if we can solve their behavior by gathering all of this information and watching all these videos and trying to decode them, then maybe we'll find a less painful interpretation of what happened, and that might lessen the pain that we're in and the hurt that we're carrying around it. So I share all of that to contextualize what might be going on for you and to validate why that's so normal. If you're going through that and wondering if it's just you who does that, I can guarantee you that you are far from alone, because pretty much everyone I've ever worked with who's gone through a breakup has been in that very same place. But also to maybe paint the picture of how that's not what you need, even though it's what you might reach for by default when you're in that place, and pointing out that oftentimes our anxiety does launch us into this mode of trying to think our way out of feeling. And I think that's true a lot of the time. And again, makes sense when we look at the fact that for a lot of anxiously attached people, holding ourselves through big emotions is really, really hard. And we are so accustomed to reaching for someone or something outside of ourselves to make that feel more tolerable. And so when we don't have that in the form of our partner, who may be the person we ordinarily go to when we're feeling that way for reassurance or soothing, it makes sense that we're just grasping at whatever other tools we have in the toolbox to try and make that feel more okay or less acute. With all of that being said, I do think we really need to acknowledge that there are some hard truths that we need to reckon with when it comes to closure. And the first one, which you might have heard me share before, is that the great irony about closure is that the relationships and the people who leave us most yearning for closure are also the people who are least likely to be willing or able to give us that closure. And what do I mean by that? Well, simply that if a relationship ends in circumstances that are deeply confusing, that feel like it was just one big shit show of conflict and unfinished conversations and a lot of emotional turmoil and disarray, such that you are standing there in amongst the rubble, not knowing what the hell just happened and understandably wanting some explanation that makes it all make sense. What makes you think that the person who left you in those circumstances is suddenly going to have the capacity to show up and give you some cogent and satisfactory explanation for why they did what they did, or what they were feeling, or what drove them to act in that way? I think that that's a really unrealistic expectation, and we have to acknowledge that if someone was unwilling or unable to show up in that way while we were in a relationship with them, that it's pretty unlikely that they're going to show up in the way we want them to after the relationship has ended. They're unlikely to have magically developed that capacity, and their willingness is likely less than it was when they were in the relationship because they no longer have that obligation. If they were in such a state of overwhelm and shutdown that they behaved in a way that was really confusing and felt really unfair, I don't think that we should be putting all of our eggs in the basket of waiting for them to suddenly show up and make themselves available for a conversation that's going to close all of the loops and bring us emotional relief. So I think we do have to look at reality as it is rather than as we wish it were, and acknowledge that if the relationship was so dysfunctional, so unhealthy, or just ended in a way that really didn't make sense, then that probably speaks to the capacity of the person we were in a relationship with. And that's something we need to find some acceptance around rather than being in denial about. Now, the next hard truth about closure is that I think closure conversations often mask a hidden agenda. And we need to be honest about that with ourselves, that sometimes it's just because we miss them and we want to have another conversation. We want a reason to reach out. We want a reason to connect with them. Sometimes it's because we want another opportunity to be heard, to explain ourselves, to maybe persuade them to see things from our point of view, to change their mind about ending the relationship if they were the one who ended it. And I think it's sort of funny because at the same time as we can be holding out hope and saying, I can't move on until I get closure, when we have these hidden agendas, we don't actually want closure because the lack of closure is what's keeping the door open, and we take some comfort in the lack of finality, because if we had closure and it was really done and dusted, we would have to face the grief of that. And so there can be this push-pull between I need closure, but also I don't really want it. And maybe we can hold on to knowing that we're probably not going to get it as a way to keep us tethered to our ex when cutting the cord feels too hard, too painful, too much. And the third hard truth that I want to share with you is that even if you did get answers, even if you sat down with your ex and they explained their thought process or how they were feeling or what they wanted and why they did what they did, those answers may not bring you the relief you're looking for. I think, again, we tell ourselves, like, I need to know what they're thinking or why would they do that? But really what we want is for them to tell us something very specific, which makes us feel better. And the truth might not do that. Sometimes the truth, which might be, I don't know, I just don't feel the same way as I used to. That might raise more questions for you and might not actually satisfy the ache. Again, I think we have to recognize that someone who behaved in a way that left us desperate for closure, they might not have the clarity to then give to us, particularly if this person, your ex, has more avoidant attachment patterns. Much of the time, they don't have a really clear and concise understanding of their own inner world and their motives and the emotional layers that sit underneath that. So expecting them to be able to offer that to you in a way that brings you relief rather than raises more questions or objections, which again, I think kind of goes back to the last one where we don't want to have a conversation where we just listen. We want to have almost a negotiation where we can persuade them out of their decision. I think we have to recognize there's as much a chance that the closure conversation is going to leave us feeling worse rather than better. And that, again, all signs point to the fact that our peace comes from choosing to give ourselves closure rather than holding out for a conversation with someone that might be more in the realm of fantasy than reality. So what does another way look like? What does it look like to give yourself closure? Now, this is going to be challenging for the anxious parts of you that are really dead set on getting it from someone else, on needing an explanation from them, on needing them to tie the bow around it for you. But what I want to offer you is that true closure is a decision to accept reality as it is and to acknowledge that you may never get answers to the questions and that you may never fully understand what happened or why. Just really acknowledging the uncertainty that you're feeling and how hard that is. Choosing to accept that it's over, even if you wish that that weren't the case. All of these things are choices that you can make in spite of the way you might be feeling. And it really shifts you from a place of being at the mercy of your feelings to acknowledging your feelings and holding them with so much care and recognition and validation, while also summoning a deeper part of you and calling on that part to lead with action and say, okay, this is feeling so hard right now, but I'm going to choose to support myself through it. I'm going to choose to take my power back. I'm not going to wait around for someone who may or may not ever show up to make me feel better. And I'm going to choose myself, right? I'm going to put one foot in front of the other. I'm going to treat moving on as a choice rather than a feeling. This is what it takes to really heal after a breakup rather than spiraling into a place of powerlessness and desperation and low self-worth. So realize that closure is a really, really powerful and loving act of self-responsibility. It is something that you can choose to give yourself by choosing to close the door, even if there are lots of loose threads and unanswered questions still sitting there. Your growth comes from learning to sit with the discomfort of that rather than frantically trying to undo it or solve it. Notice how you're analyzing, intellectualizing, problem-solving parts, trying to take you away from your pain. And while that makes so much sense, and there's a very loving intention behind that, being with the pain and learning to hold ourselves through it is actually one of the great gifts of going through a breakup, and can be such a healing experience if that's not something that you've ever really done for yourself. If you've only ever numbed out or distracted or reached for someone else to make it better for you, this is a really beautiful opportunity for you to show up for yourself in ways that you may never have before. Okay, so I really hope that that's been helpful. I hope it's given you some reframes on how you might be relating to closure, and it maybe has shifted you back into a place of agency rather than feeling like, you are at the behest of someone else and whether or not they show up for you. And of course, I know how hard breakups are. So if you're in the thick of it, I'm sending you so much love. Definitely do check out my free training on breakups, because I go into everything that I've shared here in a lot more detail there. Okay, guys, sending so much love, and I look forward to seeing you again next time.